The air was clear, pure, the cold so intense the skin on my face tingled as if pricked by a million tiny needles. My bones seemed to rattle under my shivering muscles, and my legs, frostbitten during the retreat from Rostov, were numb. To keep the blood flowing, I danced from foot to foot as I swung my arms across my chest in the entrance ditch to my one-man bunker. Through the cloud of condensing breath hovering around my head, a figure caught my eye. Hobbling from foxhole to foxhole, he spent a few minutes in each. As he came closer, I recognized him as an Oberscharführer recently released from the field surgery unit in Taganrog. I put out a hand to help him climb down into my trench. "Oberscharführer, you're taking a risk." "Na ja, Ivan's been quiet today," he replied nonchalantly. There was a wry smile on his remarkably fresh-looking face. Almost everyone else around me seemed to have aged by least 10 years since winter took its first hard grip in late November. He pulled back his camouflage jacket to show the collar of his tunic. The mirror, where 2 silver pips had been, was empty. "Schütze now," he said. Soon we were sharing stories, and I ventured to ask him why he had been demoted all the way down to Schütze. The smile on his face evaporated. "You know that girl I was living with?" I had heard the gossip. It was well known in the company that he had been in private quarters with a very attractive young Ukrainian woman. She had a rose-pink complexion and hair so blonde it had the sheen of finest gold. Everyone knew what was going on between them. I nodded. What happened? Shot herself. Used my 08 to do it. It was lucky for him that his punishment had been so lenient. As for the girl, it was certain that if we pulled back her liberators would make an example of her. Perhaps it was for that reason she had killed herself. Anyway, I didn't think it appropriate to pursue the matter further. The Oberscharführer, somehow I could not bring myself to think of him as a mere Schütze, took his Soldbuch from his tunic pocket and opened it. Inside was a picture of the woman. With a sorrowful sigh, he passed it to me. She had beautiful high cheekbones and a wide, inviting smile. It was easy to see why he had become infatuated with her. When I handed back the picture, he stared at it for a silent moment before ripping it into tiny shreds that he let fall to the snow. "It's better if I forget her," he said solemnly. Suddenly, his mood brightened. "Now I can do what I came here for. Happy birthday, Erwin." He beamed as he slapped my back. "The cook, he told me it was your birthday." It had been my turn to collect the large insulated vessel used to carry food from the field kitchen earlier that morning, the 12th of December, 1941, and I recalled having joked with the cook by asking for a little extra goulash because it was my birthday. "It's my birthday too, today," said my visitor. We chatted about how we would spend our time after our inevitable final victory. As he made to leave, a feeling of intense unease gripped me, and I hooked a hand over his shoulder to restrain him. "Watch out, you were a sitting duck when you came over. This still air is perfect for a sniper. No need to allow for wind when he aims." "You worry too much," he said, shrugging his shoulders before scrambling out of the trench. He took a few paces back the way he had come, then turned and stood for a moment, lost in some private thought, gazing across the frozen fields before slinging his rifle over his shoulder. There was a metallic clink. His head swayed under the weight of his steel helmet, then his arms fell limply to his sides. The rifle slid from his shoulder, and he slumped to his knees like a burst sack of flour. He groaned something. It might have been his girlfriend's name, before falling face first into the snow. His helmet rolled away from his head and rocked back and forth a few times before coming to rest on a patch of ice. Bright blood spread under his face, freezing in seconds into a congealed mass, its redness intensified by the purity of the snow. At the front of the helmet, exactly in the center, was a perfectly round hole. I cursed myself for mentioning my birthday to the cook and kept my head down for the rest of that day. When the dazzling winter sun had sunk below the horizon, a couple of medics recovered the frozen body of my visitor and took it to Taganrog for burial in a grave marked by the SS death rune, a cross with drooping arms in the soldier's graveyard. It was in the vindictive nature of the Russians to flatten these graveyards when they reoccupied ground we gave up, so it is certain that his grave now lies unmarked, its location forgotten. A few days later, we moved to Sambek, where we constructed strong defensive positions to protect the approach to Taganrog from the east. We, the survivors of 4. Company occupied the upper part of the settlement with orders to defend a line of approximately 1 kilometre in length, a formidable task for about 60 men. The houses were to become our accommodation, and although it was harsh to expel the inhabitants from their homes in such cold weather, they accepted the situation without complaint. It was my hope that they would find accommodation in the undamaged farm buildings scattered across the countryside, away from the village, which was now certain to attract the attention of the enemy's artillery. A woman with a child holding onto her hand patted my arm as she passed. "At least we are able to pray in our churches once more," she said. With the town cleared of civilians, we began the construction of a deep bunker, partly under the foundations of a house on steeply sloping ground. Thankfully, the earth was not completely frozen, and the heavy physical work kept us warm as we heaped the excavated soil at the side of the house. Now and then we came across buried rocks that required the skill of a pioneer truck to shift using explosives. Our excavations complete, we gathered a good stock of planks and doors to form the roof. Tree stumps, sawn to an appropriate length, formed the supports necessary to hold the whole thing up when we piled the earth from the excavation on top of the roof timbers. Finally, we installed a fireplace made from a large tin can punctured with air holes made by our bayonets. The smoke from this precious little luxury, which we used only during darkness because of the risk of attracting enemy artillery fire, filtered to the outside through a pipe taken from the oven of an abandoned cottage. Meanwhile, the machine gun crews were busy building similar constructions. Trenches linked the bunkers. Now, after our retreat from Rostov, there was nothing to do but wait until the Russians made the next move. Christmas drew near. Sporadic artillery barrages prevented our wagons bringing hot food to the front line. To make myself useful, I fetched food from the field kitchens to take to the machine gun crews in their bunkers, where, because the Russian infantry was inactive, I had time to join in a hand or two of scatter card game popular amongst the troops, as we chatted about life back in Germany. My father brought home an old musical box he found in a junk shop, recounted a Schütze as we played. He spent months in secret, taking it apart to clean it until every piece of the mechanism gleamed like new a Christmas present for Mama. 2 ballerinas twirled to the music. Between them were 3 bells. Each chimed a different note. Little bluebirds on wires pecked at 2 of the bells to make them ring, but the 3rd bird was missing. Papa handed her the present as we ate on Christmas Eve. When Mama saw the box, she burst into tears. "What is it?" Papa asked. Poor Mama couldn't speak. Dabbing her eyes with her napkin, she left the table and came back with her purse. She opened it, and to our astonishment took out the 3rd bluebird. "My father brought that very same musical box from France in 1918 when he was a soldier," said Mama. "I used to play with it for hours on end when I was a little girl, but we had to sell it to buy food. I cried my eyes out when I learned it was going, so he took off the bluebird and gave it to me to keep. He said it sang a song that only its companions could hear, and that one day it would call them back." The Schütze reached into his tunic pocket and took out a small oilskin bag. "Look," he said, taking the 3rd bluebird from the bag. "Mama said it will take me home safely when it returns to its companions." "Huh, superstitious nonsense," snorted another member of the machine gun crew. "If a shell has your name on it, you've had it just like any of us," he said, trumping one superstition with another. The telephone rang. The Unterscharführer in charge of the machine gun crew answered. "Ja, ja, he's with us," he said into the mouthpiece. He thrust the phone towards me. The line crackled, giving me time to wonder if I was about to hear some bad news from home. "Schütze Bartmann?" "Here." "Krotzer here. Bartmann, it seems you were a baker before joining the Leibstandarte." I sighed in relief. "Jawohl, Hauptsturmführer, in Berlin, the Glaser Bakery in Memmelerstrasse." "Then I have a special request to ask of you. Of course, I will do anything I can," I answered without asking any details of the request. After all, a request coming from someone of Leopold Krotzer's rank was really a politely disguised order. "Ah, good. I would like you to prepare a little treat for the men for Christmas. Cakes, perhaps? You have permission to leave your post to look for ingredients. There is a house close to the field kitchen some way to the rear of your present position. It will be at your disposal when you are ready to start baking. Good luck." It was not too difficult to find most of the ingredients for a cake or pastry for a pie. Most of them, with the exception of baking powder, were available in the truck that brought us from Rostov, and since the local women baked their own bread, every house had a suitable oven, and, I hoped, a supply of baking powder. However, after rummaging through several deserted dwellings, I finally had to concede that my search for this essential ingredient of a cake mix was in vain, so I settled on the idea of making biscuits instead. Close to my kitchen was a first aid post where the lightly wounded were patched up before being sent back to their posts. Its entrance faced towards the Russian lines. In this part of the village, there were also shelters for civilians, chiefly women and young children. Some of them I recognized as those we expelled to make way for our bunkers at the top of the slope overlooking the river at Sambek. Early on the morning of Christmas Eve, I prepared a biscuit mix with butter, eggs, milk and sugar. I kneaded it thoroughly, then rolled it out on a table before cutting it into discs with the open end of an empty tin can. As I put the last batch into the oven, there was the nearby thud of an artillery shell. I rushed outside to see smoke coming from the entrance of a cellar where refugees were sheltering. When I looked inside, I found that only 2 of them had been injured, and took them to the nearby first aid post where our medics treated their injuries, which fortunately were not serious. Returning to my kitchen, I found the batch of biscuits baked to perfection. The odd burst of Russian shells soon turned into a continual thunderous drum-roll trommelfeuer, a Christmas Day present. The Russians always made a point of mounting an attack on days the German calendar showed a celebration. We, of course, reciprocated these compliments on days important to the Russians. Nevertheless, I had a pleasant task to execute in my provisional bakery. The aroma wafting from the cast-iron oven took my thoughts back to my time as an apprentice baker in Berlin, to Herr Glaser and Fritz, my journeyman. It was my first Christmas away from home, and for a moment, an intense sadness threatened to overwhelm me. With Russian shells still ringing in the celebrations, I set out from my kitchen with a sack filled with biscuits. The shell fire suddenly stopped, the smoke from the detonations evaporating into the brilliant blueness of the sky. Sunlight sparkled on the fresh snow, and there was silence, a beautiful, peaceful silence. Like the Weihnachtsmann, the German Father Christmas, I visited every bunker to distribute my Christmas treat. When I reached the bunker where the camarade with the little bluebird lived, I was surprised to see him lying on his stomach, perched on his elbows and smiling broadly as he finished writing a letter home. "Listen to this, Erwin," he said. Then, reading from the letter, "Have been shot through both cheeks but can still talk. The bluebird is coming home. See you soon." "What happened?" I asked. "Sniper caught me having a shit." Shortly after Christmas, a storm of propaganda leaflets fell from the sky. I picked up one with the heading "Schluss mit Hitler," finish with Hitler. It showed our leader in an intoxicated state, depicted by a steel helmet worn at a peculiar angle, drinking the blood of German soldiers from a glass. Schütze Bartmann. I almost leapt into the air with fright. An officer had crept up on me to bellow in my ear. He picked up one of the leaflets scattered across the ground. "Filthy lies!" He roared, tearing it into tiny pieces, though other leaflets littered the whole area. Feeling like a naughty schoolboy, I crumpled the leaflet in my hand and tossed it over my shoulder. In the final days of 1941, the Russians launched several attacks, each floundering on the tangle of barbed wire set up by Out Pioneer Trupp on the banks of the frozen Sambek River. As always, our machine guns cut off the enemy retreat. Unusually, the Russians did not attempt to recover their wounded. They left them to die, sacrifices to the debilitating cold, with wounds that in the summer months would be considered minor. They simply lay where they fell until buried by the next snowfall. An unusually heavy barrage of artillery fire fell on our positions. The Russians were making every effort to clear us out of Sambek. Shells whistled in from the enormous guns of Russian warships sitting in the Sea of Azov. The shock waves from the detonations rang through the rock-hard ground and through the frozen soles of my boots to jar every bone in my body. When I risked a look from our bunker, it was to see chunks of sharp steel, shrapnel the length of a man's arm, scything through the air with predatory whistling sounds. They travelled at speeds that made their curving trajectory easily visible, but impossible to avoid. Anyone caught in the open risked being cut in half. A deafening salvo exploded close behind. I threw myself into the security of our bunker. Black boulders of ice and rocks the size of a man rumbled across the roof. Not a word passed between us during that bombardment. Bulging eyes and clenched teeth contorted every face into the personification of fear. At last, the pounding of the giant detonations marched towards the centre of the village, downhill from our bunker. Once more my guardian angel had looked down on me, keeping me safe. Thank God that's past. They're aiming for the church now. Probably think we have observers in the tower. A camarade sighed. When the pounding of the village at last came to an abrupt end, I poked my head into the remaining daylight. Below, on the slope sweeping down to the river, lay the smoking remains of Sambek's houses. The usher in charge of our troop scanned the area through his field glasses. "Blind gangers," he announced, looking at the ominous smoking craters with unexploded shells at their centre, hundreds of them. He chuckled. "Look at them, the crazy bastards. The pioneer trup is clearing them already." Complaints were on everyone's lips. In a futile attempt to gain relief, we made masks from scrap cloth to cover our mouths and noses so that we looked like extras on a Wild West film set. How can I eat with that stench in the air? It gets into the food. Never mind the food. It goes straight for my stomach, makes me retch. I can hardly breathe. My lungs can't take it. It can travel against the wind. How can it do that? With each passing day, the odious, sickly stink thickened as grotesque black mounds of putrefying bodies wrapped in disintegrating Russian uniforms emerged from the retreating snow. Nothing could hold back the revolting stench. Every intake of breath, a subconscious act under normal circumstances, was a nauseating ordeal. At last our leaders took heed of our complaints. A Wehrmacht unit arrived with a gang of Russian prisoners to clear up the mess. With masks of tattered rags pulled over their noses, the prisoners pulled at the heaps of rotting flesh to disentangle one putrid corpse from the next, often finding themselves in possession of a detached arm or leg. In an incident of comic horror, as a prisoner dragged a body by the legs to the nearby pit that was to be its grave, the head came loose. Still holding the legs of his dead comrade, the prisoner instinctively stuck out a leg in an attempt to stop the head escaping, but it rolled over his outstretched foot and, gathering speed, bounced erratically over lingering patches of ice towards the river. The Russians on the other side of the river must have seen all this happening, but not wishing to fire on their own men, their weapons remained silent. Rumours went the rounds that we were to be withdrawn from the Meuse-Sambek line, but nothing happened until the 21st of May when the SS Police Division arrived. We packed what little personal belongings we had and made ready to leave. It had been an exhausting winter, and we looked forward to a period of recuperation as our column of vehicles made its way towards Taganrog. As evening fell, our trucks turned to head back towards Sambek. There was no need for words. Grimaces of disappointment cut across every man's face. Soon we were back at the village, repelling an attack that had broken through the lines of the SS police units who were now struggling to hold our old positions. Once more, the Leibstandarte showed the enemy our capabilities by vigorously repelling their breakthrough. That evening, we were back in the bunker we had constructed just before Christmas. Every other day, Russian propaganda leaflets urging us to surrender fluttered from the sky. This was a waste of paper, not only because the men of the Leibstandarte had made an unbreakable oath to Hitler, but also because we knew the fate awaiting Waffen-SS men who fell into Russian captivity. We had not forgotten the Handschuhe torture inflicted on the reconnaissance troop in Taganrog. Their offer of fair treatment to surrendering German troops having met with no success, the enemy continued their propaganda efforts with loudspeakers set on poles. A female voice boomed out over the spring meadows with taunts about the infidelity of our wives and girlfriends. But, having never had a girlfriend, this hardly troubled me. The loudspeaker rant finished with, "We wish the Leibstandarte a happy break in France and look forward to seeing you again later." We looked at each other quizzically, wondering if it could be true. Given the conditions we had endured over the winter, the prospect of a sojourn in France was appealing, though, we thought, too unrealistic for us to take seriously. A few days of pleasant weather passed, and again we received notice that we would be withdrawn. Then, under the cloak of darkness, a Romanian unit took over our positions, and we set off once more for Taganrog. We could hardly believe it when once more the order came to turn around. After a day of close-quarter fighting, we again retook our old positions in Sambek. In the end, we left with both the SS Police Division and the Romanians defending the village. Though severely depleted after our Rostov foray, the Leibstandarte had twice retaken a line that required 2 other full divisions to defend. After a few days in Taganrog, we moved west to Mariupol, a large port on the Sea of Azov, to help keep the coast secure. By this time it had become warm, though there was a refreshing onshore breeze, a welcome change from the white winds of winter. Making good use of our free time, we exposed our startlingly pale bodies to the sunshine and bathed in the sea at the foot of steep cliffs. With the absence of enemy activity, it seemed like heaven to be able to sleep undisturbed through the night until roll call at the unusually late hour of 7 a.m. At a delousing facility set up near our camp, I was relieved to get rid of the plague of lice and the continual scratching that made my skin raw around the belt line of my trousers. Once more, life was good, and the cold that had taken up residence in my bones finally succumbed to the warmth of the sun. We moved inland to Stalino, where the weather was unbearably hot. We slept in tents with the entrance flaps tied wide open at night to allow any cooling breeze to do its work. At this time, a few raw recruits from Lichterfelde joined our company, bringing first-hand news of what was happening in Berlin and other parts of the Reich. But our stay in Stalino was no holiday. Training became the daily routine with morning roll call at 6 a.m. On a particularly hot day, an Oberscharführer attached to the divisional staff office issued letters to those who had won military awards. Those of us who had participated in the Rostov campaign were presented with the Sturmabzeichen, a badge awarded for enduring at least 10 days of continuous combat. That evening, after proudly passing my award around newly arrived recruits, I held it between my fingers and, like a child with a new toy, examined every detail of its construction. I had won my first decoration and was beginning to feel like a real veteran. We were lounging on the grass, half-heartedly cleaning our boots when Boris came running with a towel around his neck, shaving lather on half his face. "We're leaving tomorrow. For France. Get packing." I was unconvinced. "Who says?" "It's official. The Usher got the news straight from Krotzer." He stretched out his arms and bellowed melodically, "Farewell, farewell to Mother Russia." Like me, Boris was a great fan of opera. A spontaneous cheer went up. We sprang to our feet. "Thank God I can't stand this heat," one of the recruits sighed. "Hey, hold on," I cautioned. "Remember that woman on the loudspeaker at Sambeck? How did she know we were going to France?" "Spies," said Boris. "Spies, or some poor bastard of an officer was captured and spilled the beans before the Russians slit open his belly and spilled his guts." In early July, our assault guns and trucks were loaded onto long, low-slung transport wagons. The men travelled mostly in goods wagons, while the officers had a couple of proper carriages at the head of the train. With jubilant hearts, our Kompanietrupp clambered into a goods wagon with a medical orderly for company. As we slid from the station, Boris could talk of nothing but the beautiful girls we would meet, and found a willing audience amongst his sex-starved Kameraden. "I was in Toulouse once on holiday," he enthused. "Ach Mensch, the French girls are so pretty. I can't wait to get there." "Are they prettier than the Danish girls?" asked the medic. "You wait, your eyes will pop out of your head," countered Boris. "Well, I've still not used any of my condoms," I chipped in. I simply had not had time to think of girls since entering the Lichterfelde barracks the previous summer. Although I was now 18.5 years old, I had never slept with a girl. But being somewhat shy of discussing such matters, I did not intend to disclose this detail to my companions. "Me neither," came a call from the corner of the wagon. "Not a single fucking one. Never had a girl in my life." Everyone laughed. Most of the ordinary soldiers in the Leibstandarte had battled unrelentingly for months without a single day's leave, without a single full night's sleep until we left Sambeck. The very thought of women had been locked beyond reach in the back of our young minds. After a few hours, we came to a halt at a small town. Because of the sweltering heat, we were allowed leave the wagon and stand around the station. Jokes about returning to rescue the Romanians sprung up, although it was by no means beyond the bounds of possibility that we could be called upon to rescue them yet again. As we lounged in the welcoming shade of a stand of trees, a few locals took pity on our boredom and offered a local alcoholic drink that was taken hot, and, out of politeness, we accepted their offer. A whistle blew and we clambered into our wagons which, still heading to the west, trundled into the vast countryside. Singing broke out the length of the train, different songs from every wagon, a cacophony of joy. Within us, the flame of loyalty to our Führer still burned brightly. With body and soul, we were the proud instruments of his will, a manifestation of the spiritual power he had awakened within the Deutsche Volk. As nightfall approached, I stood at the open door of the wagon, watching the high, wispy clouds turn pink, then red, as the Ukrainian countryside swayed lazily by, clickety-click, kilometre after endless kilometre. There was something alluring about the Ukrainian landscape. Perhaps it was the enormity of the sky, and I wondered if one day I would return, after we had won the war, perhaps. When the warm, velvety darkness at last cloaked the landscape, I took my place among my Kameraden, who were already asleep on straw-filled sacks' heavenly beds, in comparison to the broken bricks of some wrecked house or the confinement of cold bunkers shuddering under an artillery barrage. A mist of golden straw dust swirled in the almost horizontal shaft of morning sunlight that struck in from the ventilation opening high in the wall of the wagon. Gradually I came to my senses after what must have been at least 8 hours of unbroken sleep. "Morgan Irvin," chirped a voice. The words came from a silhouette leaning nonchalantly, hands in trouser pockets, against the open door of the wagon. I recognized the voice as that of the medic, a veteran of the battle at Dunkirk. Still drowsy, I rose unsteadily to my feet and brushed the straw from my uniform. Morgan Hans. I stepped carefully over my still sleeping Kameraden to reach the doorway and shaded my eyes with a hand to peer into the sunlit countryside. Shouldn't we keep inside in case there are partisans in the area? Nah, we're too far from the front, relax. I let my hand drop from my face and drew the fresh morning air deep into my lungs. It's a beautiful morning. Sleep well? I yawned widely. Too well. I ran my hand through my hair. I was dreaming. About France. Ah, France. You'll like France. I had the chance to visit Paris after Dunkirk. Do you think the British will try another landing? It's possible. I doubt we're being moved there simply to give us a holiday. A woman waved to us as she hung out washing in her backyard. We returned her greeting. The British. They shouldn't be hard to push back into the sea, I offered. Don't underestimate the British. They have brave and capable officers. Sepp Dietrich respects them. He even ordered a military funeral for a British major who resisted capture by grabbing the rifle from one of our men's hands, then clubbing him with it. A fellow called Tichatsky, from Oberallgäu, if my memory serves me well. He found the major hiding in a burnt-out tank. Unfortunately, he was killed after a struggle. The guard of honor was from 1 company. They fired the salute over the grave. There was a tap on my shoulder. It was Boris, our Romanian camarade. Stand clear, Erwin. I need a piss. He stood at the edge of the open wagon door and unbuttoned his fly. After travelling for several days, trains carrying military personnel seldom took a direct route. We came to siding in a rail yard somewhere in Saarland, Germany, where we jumped out to stretch our legs. A 2-metre high timber fence, which Hans immediately started to clamber over, obscured our view of the other side. I'm choking for a beer. Anyone coming with me? I looked at him in astonishment, wondering how he had the nerve to leave the yard without permission. What if the train leaves? Ha! Just tell them to hang on a bit. He laughed. Sitting on top of the fence, the medic paused to wave to a couple of his mates, who, having also found their thirst for beer overwhelming, were already on the other side. They're crazy, said Boris. If the train leaves without them, they'll be in shot for desertion. Time passed. Now and then, one or other of us stood on our tiptoes to peer longingly at a bar on a street corner, not too far away. The sly old dog, said Boris. He must have known there was a pub close by. When the locomotive's whistle blew, faces red with drink appeared along the top edge of the fence, among them that of our medic, Hans. I've got something for you, he chuckled. There was the chinking of glass against glass, and 4 bottles of Weissbier appeared above the line of the fence, one after the other. Welcoming hands on our side rescued them. The locals donated them. Now help me over before that train gets going. We were posted a village lying to the southeast of Paris, where we slept soundly on the floor of the village hall, our minds free at last from thoughts of sudden death, or the horrific wounds the following day might bring. Training began as usual with roll call at 6 a.m., but except for nights spent on sentry duty, there was plenty of free time to play cards or chess. Disappointingly, there was still no opportunity for the keenly anticipated encounters with attractive young French women. On a glorious summer's morning, a few days after settling into our new billet, an Unterscharführer, a ruddy-faced farmer's son from Austria, called out a list of names at roll call, ordering those mentioned to remain behind. My name was amongst those called. When the remainder of the company had been dismissed, I looked around and recognized faces I had seen on the Ostfront, each one carrying a look of bewilderment. A smile broke across the Usher's naturally ruddy face. "I have a pleasant surprise for you old hares from the Ostfront," he announced in a voice that boomed like alpine thunder. "Today you will see the sights of Paris." His arm swung elegantly in the direction of a truck waiting at the edge of the assembly area. "Gentlemen, take your seats." The truck's engine revved impatiently as we clambered into the back. As we sped through a village, a pretty girl about 18 years old stood on a street corner shielding her eyes against the sun. She smiled and waved as we passed. Of course, as young men do, we returned her favour with raucous yells of approval and loud whistles as she shrank into the distance, holding her long brown hair against the side of her face in the turbulent air. Dazzling little white clouds sailed across the deep blue summer sky as we travelled the long straight roads. Barely a word passed between us as the sun beat down on our heads. We were warm, happy, feeling more like tourists than soldiers. As we approached the Seine, the streets became wider, the buildings more pleasing to the eye. It was a pleasure to drive along well-made roads free of rubble, to see the citizens go about their everyday life. Thankfully, this beautiful city, Paris, had been largely spared the attention of our Stukas. A wide bridge lined with ornate street lamps carried us over the Seine. Boris squealed like an excited child, pointing into the distance. "Look, look, the Eiffel Tower." Most of us had seen the newsreels showing Hitler admiring this spectacular feat of engineering, and we were disappointed to see it slip behind a row of trees without Fist paying a visit. Soon we came to a halt on an immense plaza, at the edge, I thought, of some extensive park. The passenger door of the cab slammed, and our Usher appeared at the side of the truck. "Everybody out." We jumped down and stood wide-eyed, drinking in the beauty of our surroundings. "Come," said our Usher. "There is something I wish to show you." We followed like obedient schoolboys on a day trip as our Usher marched us briskly towards a tall stone obelisk at the edge of the plaza. "Granite," announced the Usher on reaching the base of the obelisk, "from Luxor." I let my gaze drift over the mysterious symbols carved into its surface, towards the pointed pinnacle. The hieroglyphs tell the story of Ramses I and II, pharaohs of ancient Egypt, continued our Usher. The inscriptions are more than 3,000 years old. Now turn around. We had stopped not at the edge of a park, as I had at first thought, but near the entrance to a magnificent boulevard lined either side by rows of trees. "The Avenue des Champs-Élysées," declared our Usher like a pompous tour guide. "Those splendid marble statues at either side of the road are the horses of Mali. As you see, their strength is subdued by their grooms, a wonderful metaphor for man's power over the forces of nature. In the distance, you can see the Arc de Triomphe, the tallest archway in the world. You will soon get a closer look at that," he said, turning back towards the waiting truck, "but not today." Leaving the leafy boulevards behind, we drove along narrow streets with blocks of flats forming cliff faces on either side. Every window was open, shutters flung back against the wall, to capture any breeze that might temper the rising heat. The name of the street stuck in my memory, probably because of its surprising name, Rue d'Amsterdam. A turn took us into a generous boulevard with a central reservation thick with trees, welcome shade for citizens who went about their business without showing the slightest inclination to concede that their country was under enemy occupation. "Die Rote Mühle," exclaimed Boris, pointing to an incongruous red windmill perched on top of a low building, the famed Moulin Rouge. Our truck's tyres squealed as we came to an abrupt standstill on the hot cobblestones. At the side of the truck stood a man astride a tricycle laden with baguettes a metre long, his eyes silently scolding us with a look that said, "Watch where you're going, why don't you?" To our delight, We spent the rest of the afternoon in the Moulin Rouge, watching the shapely chorus girls dance as we sipped cool beer. Several days after our visit to the Moulin Rouge, we revisited Paris. It was pleasant enough just to be able to stroll in the shade of the trees, but inevitably, it seemed, we found ourselves in a bar close to a Soldatenheim set up by the Wehrmacht. As soon as we sat at a table, the girls in the bar swooped on us, pressing their lithe bodies against our backs, pulling up chairs to sit with their arms around our shoulders. Of course they were prostitutes, but their scent, the cool stroke of their soft fingers on my cheek, inflamed the innate urge that obliges young men to seek the company of young women. We bought them drinks, laughed at their broken German until one of the girls, young and beautiful, began to sing Je t'aimerai. My spine seemed to melt, shivers of pleasure surged across my skin. Desire and nostalgia merged into a single glorious emotion for which I have no name. A faint blush came to the girl's pale cheeks as the last note left her lips. A burst of loud applause from everyone in the bar shattered an appreciative moment of silence. The girl smiled demurely and lowered her eyes as we broke into our own song, Das ist Berlin. Suddenly the door of the bar crashed open to reveal our Austrian usher, carrying a girl under his arm, her legs flailing the air. None of us had noticed him leave, but we laughed heartily at his reappearance. The girl shrieked something in French as he lowered her to her feet. Her companions, sitting with us at the table, gasped as if some miracle had been revealed to them. "What is it?" I asked them. The girls looked at each other, then burst into squeals of delight. One of them rushed up to our giant Unterscharführer, slipped a hand over his crotch and gasped, "Mon Dieu." Though I knew she was a prostitute, my dreams for the next few nights took me back to the bar in Paris, to the girl who sang so beautifully. What was a nice girl doing working in such a place? A cliché, of course, but I was too young at the time to realize the foolishness of my infatuation. I imagined holding her hand, kissing her lips. Even in daytime, my thoughts returned to the bar where she worked. A Rottenführer from the quartermaster's store turned up at evening roll call with a measuring tape over his shoulder. Beside him, an assistant stood holding a clipboard. "Today I have the pleasure of measuring you for the new black dress uniforms you will wear at the Victory Parade in Berlin, when we have won the war," boasted the Rottenführer. "You must all look impeccable in front of the Führer. It will be a very special day for the whole world." Since I had never had one of these smart uniforms, I looked forward to visiting the photographer's studio where my mother now worked, to have my photograph taken while wearing it. Having completed his measurements, the Rottenführer made a further announcement. "As you might have heard, Hauptsturmführer Springer has been transferred from 3 company to 1 company. As a mark of respect and thanks for his men, he and a few fellow officers have, at some risk to themselves, travelled unarmed into the unoccupied zone while posing as businessmen to acquire some of those items that are, for the moment, unavailable in the shops back home. You may purchase these at the company shop when off duty." It was an offer most of us accepted. I bought a silk scarf and 2 pairs of silk stockings, treasures to send home to my mother, who I had not seen since I left for the Ostfront the previous summer. Reinforcements, their young and eager faces bronzed by the strong French sunshine, were arriving in droves, but none had yet found their way to our Kompanietrupp. Fresh combat uniforms were issued, and we cleaned our vehicles, including the new ones that had just arrived, until not a single speck of mud or dust remained on them. An air of excitement enveloped the whole company. At morning roll call, an officer made a proclamation. "As you may have suspected, over the last few days preparations have been in progress for a special occasion. In a few days, the whole of the Leibstandarte will gather in Paris to take part in a grand parade on the Champs-Élysées. Nothing will be allowed to interrupt this event, not even a bombing raid by the British. Every man must look his best for this event. Boots and weapons must be polished till they gleam no dirt under the fingernails." A few days later, with our equipment and personal possessions stowed in our truck, we set off for Paris to join with the other battalions of the Leibstandarte, which now consisted of around 20,000 men and dozens of new tanks, artillery pieces and flak batteries, everything that a fully equipped panzer division should have. We arrived in the assembly area and waited to take our place in the column of vehicles now stretching along the entire length of the sun-drenched Avenue des Champs-Élysées. At last, our truck joined the parade. We stiffened our shoulders and looked straight ahead, determined to look our best for our leader, Super Sepp Dietrich. Soon we were passing between the magnificent horses of Mali. Wehrmacht soldiers lined the roadsides. Behind them, rows of French civilians looked on from the shade of the trees. To our right, as we approached the Arc de Triomphe, stood General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt, commanding officer of the army in France, with our diminutive steel-helmeted Sepp Dietrich by his side. At the precise moment we came alongside them, our heads turned smartly towards the admiring generals. Von Rundstedt acknowledged our passing with a nod of his field marshal's baton. After the terrible battering we had taken in Russia, the Leibstandarte was once more a force capable of executing the will of our Führer. After the parade, we drove to a field on the outskirts of Paris where it seemed every high-ranking German in France had assembled. Generals of the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, admirals of the Kriegsmarine and chiefs of the Luftwaffe, to witness a demonstration of our assault tactics using live ammunition. At the end of the manoeuvres, we packed our equipment. As I passed a telephone box to Boris, stripped to the waist as he stood on the back of our truck, he rolled his eyes in warning. I glanced over my shoulder to see Sepp Dietrich in the company of several high-ranking officers. Although they remained too far away to hear exactly the words that passed between them, it was clear that praise was gushing from their smiling mouths. "They love our Sepp," said Boris, hands on hips, watching the entourage pass between the rows of vehicles. "We all do," I chirped. "He's the pride of Germany. I don't know if we could have survived Russia without him." "He's so small compared to us," said Boris. "Who would expect that a little man could be such a fine leader?" "Boris," I said patiently, "Napoleon was no giant." "No, but they say our Austrian Unterscharführer is in more ways than one," he laughed. The story of our Austrian usher amusing the prostitute in Paris by hanging a bucket full of water on his erect penis had done the rounds. "Well, sometimes size does matter," I conceded. After packing our equipment onto our trucks, we drove to the west, to a village near Francheville in Normandy, where we took up quarters in a large room above the restaurant of a hotel, set in an idyllic, leafy spot close to a stream. A few days later, news came of my promotion to Sturmmann, the first step on the promotion ladder. Sepp Dietrich himself signed the relevant documents in St. Quentin. Immediately, I wrote to my parents to tell them my news. The perpetually dejected look on the hotel proprietor's face betrayed the dismay he felt at our presence, but no doubt hoping we soon leave, he never complained, and we more or less kept out of his way. A delivery of proper bunk beds and lockers, which we installed in our room, served only to darken his mood. As in the Lichterfelde barracks, each locker was shared by 2 men, an affirmation of the mutual trust that extended to the battlefield. We arranged everything in the room so that a gable end was free to allow one of our Kameraden, who was handy with a paintbrush, to decorate the wall with an enormous eagle grasping a swastika in its talons. Similar in design to the badges sewn onto the sleeves of our tunics, this artwork was a sight that brought an involuntary grunt of disapproval to the proprietor's throat when he first saw it, but it made us feel more at home. The hotel proprietor's mood slumped further when we welcomed fresh recruits to our company troop. Among them, Heinz Ehlers, Heinz König, a chap called Warnecke, and another by the name of Bruder, who was to become our driver. These were all the type of men we expected to welcome as Kameraden, tall and in prime physical condition, but there was one chap who didn't fit the bill at all. "You must have got yourself lost, my friend," remarked Boris. The recruit looked at him accusingly. "What do you mean?" "This is the Leibstandarte," said Boris, as if no further explanation was required. "What are you talking about?" challenged the misfit. "Well," said Boris, "you're so how can I put this, small." "Sepp Dietrich's not much taller than me," said the recruit indignantly. "You can hardly compare yourself with him," retorted Boris, striking an aggressive pose with his square chin thrust towards the little man. Not wishing to get off to a bad start with the new arrival, I struck up a more friendly tone. "What's your name?" "Heuss," answered the recruit aloofly. Boris, annoyed by the arrogant attitude of the little man, was growing red in the face. "Heuss, is that supposed to tell me something?" "My father is a professor at the University of Stuttgart." "Ah, pulling strings," said Boris, slowly shaking his head. Once their excitement had quietened down, the new arrivals started to blend well with the rest of the Kompanietruppe. Although training and guard duty filled most of our days, morning roll call took place later than usual, sometimes not until 8 a.m. It quickly became our custom during fine weather to take our evening meal sandwiches, usually, sitting stripped to the waist at a long wooden picnic table under a tree in the grounds of the hotel. On one such sunny evening, we were discussing whether we should complete a form issued earlier in the day. Signing this form would release us from our membership of the church, and therefore of the payment of Kirchensteuer, a small tax deducted from our wages to help pay for the upkeep of the churches in Germany. Though I did, and still do, believe in an ultimate creator of the universe, I decided the money would be better in my pocket than in the coffers of the church, and duly signed the release form. Every Catholic in the Kompanietruppe declined this opportunity, deciding to remain faithful to his church. As the sun sank behind the trees lining the nearby roadway, our conversation turned inevitably to girls we had seen in the streets or in shops, but had remained, as always, out of reach. To my immediate right was Heinz Ehlers, and sitting beyond him was Furch, the handsomest man in our troop, if not the whole of 4. Company. "I tell you," said Ehlers, turning to Furch. They were looking straight at me. Right into my eyes, they were practically begging me to speak to them. I ruffled his hair as he spoke. It's the blonde hair Benjamin and the youthful looks. Because Heinz Ehlers was the youngest member of our Kompanietruppe, I had given him the nickname Benjamin after the youngest of the 12 sons of the biblical Joseph. A car drew up, out of sight behind the hedge that ran along the edge of the hotel's gardens. 2 doors slammed. The lazy metallic squeak of the rusty gates to the yard brought us instinctively to attention. An unfamiliar high-ranking officer strolled towards us, hands clasped behind his back. At his side was a familiar face, an Untersturmführer from our own battalion. "I've seen that officer before," I whispered to Heinz Ehlers, "at company headquarters, a Sturmbannführer from Berlin. What he's after with us." We fell silent as the 2 officers approached. The leaves of the trees rustled in the warm breeze. "Sturmbannführer Linger is looking for personnel to assist him," announced our Untersturmführer. Linger looked us up and down, one after the other. After a moment of thought, he nodded curtly in Furch's direction. "What is your name?" Furch's body stiffened. "Schütze Ferk, Sturmbannführer. Come out from behind that table to allow Sturmbannführer Linger to get a better look at you," said the Untersturmführer. Furch, his cheeks reddening, shuffled from behind the table and strode up to the 2 officers. Linger eyed Furch slowly from head to toe, then nodded curtly before turning to march back towards the gateway and the waiting car. I slapped Furch on the shoulders. "You lucky devil. Do you know who that was?" I asked. Furch, puzzled, shook his head. "Linger is Hitler's chief valet. You'll be back in Berlin in the Reichskanzlei before you can say bonjour." A few days later, Furch was told to collect his equipment and report to Bataillon HQ. That was the last I saw of him. In mid-August 1942, the Allies stormed ashore at Dieppe, about 100 kilometers to the north. We prepared for battle and moved out of our comfortable billet above the restaurant. Fortunately for us, the landing turned into a disaster for the Allies. They tried to create bridgeheads at several places along the coast, but their tanks had floundered in the deep shingle on the beaches. Only one tank managed to get onto the esplanade, and our artillery sank one of their warships. After taking heavy casualties, the survivors, mostly Canadians, were taken prisoner by Wehrmacht units. The mood amongst our men was one of elation. For the second time, German forces had easily repelled an enemy force from the beaches of France. Although the Leibstandarte was never called to defend against the raid on Dieppe, we were shortly afterwards sent to a nearby camp that had been set up to handle the many prisoners that had been taken. A handful of prisoners had set fire to the huts in the camp and had threatened to break out, but our presence was required only for a few hours. When we returned to our old billet above the restaurant by the river, we discovered that our painting of the eagle had been scraped from the wall. Of course, we were annoyed about this and promptly summoned the proprietor. "I meant no offence, gentlemen, but surely you can understand my position," he said, shrugging his shoulders in Gallic fashion with the palms of his shaking hands upturned. "Let's not make a big thing of this," I said, taking pity on the Frenchman. "Find us some paint, and that will be an end to the matter." We repainted the wall with our SS insignia, but moved out of that billet only a few days later to a gardener's house in the grounds of an elegant chateau surrounded by rich apple orchards. In front of the chateau, standing in the idyllic gardens, was an enormous tree. Nearby, on the lawn, lay a broken flagpole, which we soon repaired. Every morning at 8 a.m, our company gathered there for roll call as our flag was hoisted. However, I did not benefit from this late start to the day. I had to get up more than an hour earlier than the rest of the men to collect the latest weather report from the radio post. After wakening Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller, now our company leader, at 7 a.m. for his morning coffee and croissant, I read the weather report to him as he ate. It was around this time that I learned I had been awarded the Ostmedaille, a medal issued to those who had endured the hard winter on the Ostfront. Heinz Ehlers and I were appointed batmen to Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller, who was very strict but always correct in his treatment of us. After roll call, we brushed down his uniform, cleaned his boots, and did any other little chores that came our way. This was not as tedious as it sounds because he had a radio, and we could listen to German stations as we worked. On several occasions we were present when Waldmüller was listening to the BBC, and he warned us to guard our conversation against ever mentioning this. Another of our tasks was to steam open letters written by the men in our company. Waldmüller examined everyone in detail. If they contained information relating to our location in France, he simply tossed them into a waste paper bin, the contents of which we would later burn. As Waldmüller's batman, one of my more unpleasant duties was to sort through the belongings of fallen Kameraden, and it happened that amongst those of a soldier killed at the start of the Russian campaign was a Belgian FN 7.65 caliber pistol. Having been stored for about a year in one of our trucks, the weapon was in a sad state with the barrel badly rusted. To free it off, I took it into the garden at the rear of the Hauptsturmführer's quarters and fired a couple of rounds into the earth. Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller was taking roll call the following Saturday. When it came to my name, his broad forehead creased into a heavy frown as he announced that with immediate effect I was to be punished with 3 days in the bunker, a hut in a nearby wood with little more than 4 walls and a leaky roof. Somehow, Waldmüller had learned that I had taken a shortcut in cleaning the pistol by firing it into the ground. There was a window in the bunker, but no glass to keep out the rain. The bed was a plank of wood and a blanket, and I settled down to serve my 3 days' detention. Apart from being chilly at night, my time in the bunker was not unpleasant. The fine summer weather brought many passers-by, some of whom were Flemish nationals. Often they stopped to chat and gave me things to eat and drink. On Sunday evening, the UVD came to tell me that I was a free man, a day early. This was not an altruistic act of remission by Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller. He had simply missed my services, and there was no record made of the offence in my Soldbuch. On resuming my duties as batman, Waldmüller said nothing of the matter, and our relationship promptly returned to normal. Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller celebrated his 30th birthday the following Saturday, a day early, an event well attended by his many officer friends from Bataillon and Company HQ. The merriment, fueled by the consumption of large amounts of wine and cognac, continued in his office in the chateau for most of the afternoon. To round off the party, Waldmüller led his guests to the gardens, where he fired off a whole magazine from his P-38 machine pistol at the nearby church tower. There was a loud ringing sound and a few sparks as the rounds struck the bell. Soon the priest appeared at the chateau, his stern face glowing with anger, but Waldmüller managed to placate him with his explanation that he was only having a bit of fun because it was his birthday. The following day, I delivered Waldmüller's written apology to the church authorities. At weekends, we came off duty after the evening meal and were free to do as we pleased, but still there was no opportunity to get to know the local girls. Not that it mattered a great deal, since the scant contact we did have left us in no doubt that there was little chance of striking up a friendship with them. We were young men reaching the peak of sexual desire, and the situation was driving us insane. As a distraction from thoughts of girls, a few of us from the Kompanietruppe took the opportunity to make a Saturday evening trip to the nearby village pub for a beer or two. Already in the bar were several Flemish chaps who were friendly towards us. One of our Kompanietruppe was from Cologne and spoke a dialect of German that our new friends could understand without great difficulty. Soon we were sitting round a table sharing tales as we sipped our beer, taking turns to buy rounds of drinks. One of the Flemish chaps called out from the bar, "Coffee for everyone?" Not wishing to offend our new friends, we accepted the offer. The second cup seemed to taste better than the first, the third more pleasing than the second. Before long, I had lost count of the number of cupfuls I had taken. At last, after an enjoyable evening, it was time leave. We thanked our Flemish companions for their warm hospitality, and, wishing them well for the future, stepped into the cool night air. It hit us like a sledgehammer. As we found out later, our Flemish friends had laced there, and our coffee with Calvados, an apple brandy distilled locally. Under the combined effect of caffeine and alcohol, we staggered down the road, holding each other up. Somehow Ehlers and I became separated from the rest of our Kameraden, and eventually realized we were lost. A railway embankment seemed familiar, so we climbed up to the track and tried to focus on the surrounding landmarks to get our bearings. A whistle blew. Ehlers thumped into me from behind, and I found myself rolling down the embankment, arms and legs flailing the air. "Erwin," Ehlers slurred when we came to a halt. "Watch out for trains." On Sunday morning I woke with a pounding headache. How Ehlers and I managed to find our way back to the gardener's house I shall never know. At breakfast, embarrassing stories of our exploits in the village, none of which I was able to recall, passed among our Kameraden. Some of these stories were, I dearly hope, fabrications of their vivid imaginations intended to cause us the maximum embarrassment. We had heard the drone of enemy aircraft engines, even the hiss of wings cutting through the moist night air, but had never seen the aircraft themselves. Skillful pilots must have flown them as they came in low under cover of darkness with feathered engines to make their approach as quiet as possible. Despite our many patrols in the surrounding countryside, their landing strip remained undiscovered, though we were certain each flight brought in agents and instructors for the French underground fighters. In an effort to track the incoming enemy aircraft, Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller had an observation platform installed high up in an ancient oak tree in the garden of the chateau. A ladder, secured by a rope, led up to the stout, almost horizontal lower branches. Higher branches had been cut to allow a person to use the stumps to climb to a second ladder, leading to the platform constructed in the sawn-off crown. It was a nerve-wracking experience to climb up to that tiny platform large enough for just one person, but it offered excellent views of the surrounding countryside. A telephone allowed the rapid communication of any intelligence gathered by an observer perched up there. It was manned day and night. One evening, when I was on guard duty at the chateau, a party of high-ranking officers and their wives arrived to marvel at the platform. Among them was the recently appointed commander of our battalion, Sturmbannführer Albert Frey. Frey was from Heidelberg and the son of a master baker, so at least I shared something in common with our highly decorated leader. His wife, Lotta, was a particularly fine-looking and vivacious woman with a marvellous figure. She insisted on clambering up to the observation platform just to see how the world looks from up there. This was a courageous act for a woman. Even during daytime, it required a cool head to climb up to the platform and an even cooler head to tackle the descent. Having been on observation duty there on several occasions, I can personally testify to that. My stint as Batman to Waldmüller came to an end when I was appointed courier to the company. Every evening, including the weekends, I carried written communications between battalion and company headquarters, a journey that took 2 hours on foot. One particularly wet evening, soon after I had heard the news that our divisional commander, Fritz Witt, had been to Paris to select girls for bordellos for the exclusive use of the Leibstandarte, I passed the local inn as usual. A bike was leaning unattended against the wall. I paused to stare at it for a moment, thinking it would at least halve my journey time. However, it would be risky to remove the bike without the owner's consent, and if caught I would certainly be fined and, perhaps, stripped of my recent promotion. I looked to the sky. The grey sheet of cloud showed no sign of lifting. I grabbed the handlebars, swung my leg over the bar and pedalled hard, hoping to avoid being spotted. Having completed my journey to Battalion HQ, I pedalled back to the inn as fast as I could, thinking that, if the bike had been reported missing, the military police would already be waiting there for me. Luckily, the bike's temporary absence passed unnoticed, so I put it back exactly where I had found it, and, having worked up a good thirst, called into the inn for a beer. Standing at the bar was one of our Flemish friends. I bought him a drink and told him my tale about the bike. "Ah, that would be my bike you're speaking about." He chuckled. He slapped my shoulder. "Don't worry about it. The state I'm in, I don't think I could manage to ride it anyway."